Welcome to Earth Unearthed. We are your hosts, Akash and Ruchir.
Earth Unearthed is a fortnightly podcast where we deconstruct themes from movies and TV shows to discuss the economics, politics, and science behind it.
This is the second part of our conversation with Srinath. You'll find the first part where we talked about origin symptoms and preventive measures related to coronavirus and the concept of R naught right below this part's episode on the app that you listen to your podcast on. In this second part, we cover regulations around testing and vaccine development, conspiracy theories around possible cures, lockdowns and their economic impact, as well as supply chain and how to get out of this economic crisis that has been induced by the coronavirus.
In one of the scenes, we notice how a leading scientist who was able to separate the culture eventually was very frustrated because the Center for Disease Control decided for some reason to allow virus research and development only for BSL-4 labs and above. In another similar scene, a vaccine development researcher injects herself with the vaccine under trial in order to expedite the trials process. So these are just a few examples of how regulations may adversely affect progress. There are many such regulations in real life too. For example, let me give you the case of regulations in the United States, which is actually a country with the lesser number of regulations compared to India. So in the United States, there are restrictions on doctors practicing across state lines and the state restrictions on telemedicine. The same thing. Basically, even doctors cannot practice across state lines, and there are restrictions on telemedicine being used in another state. So there are certificate of need rules for hospitals to add beds. There are rules restricting online higher education across states. Rules requirements for certain professionals to work in offices only, and hours of service regulations for truck drivers. And this list goes on and on. So, Akash, I know you have a strong opinion on regulation and the hurdles it creates. And you even co-authored an article on regulation specific to testing in India. Would you like to discuss how regulatory hurdles have impeded this fight against coronavirus?
Yeah, Richard, you correctly mentioned many of these regulatory hurdles that impeded the fight against coronavirus in the US. In India, it was not just the same story, but actually things were even worse. The ICMR licensing rules killed the private market for testing. And if you look at it, when the coronavirus outbreak happened, what ICMR did was that it basically put a blanket ban on all the private testing instruments which were not certified by US FDA or the European agency. And it turned out that there was just one company across India which had that license. And in a week, basically, when they realized it, they said that, okay, turn in your testing kits to us and we'll take a week and then we'll release the results. Only the kits which are 100% which identify 100% true positive and 100% true negatives will be allowed. Now there were a host of companies which basically got licensed, and they were able to make the cut. But what it did was that it essentially took away 2 weeks, two very important weeks in India's fight against coronavirus. Then after that, basically all the labs which will do the testing across India using those testing kits, they had to be certified by ICMR. So it was all a huge mess. I think, I mean, there is quite a lot to be said here. I have written an article, as you mentioned, using both empirical data and even the economic theory. So I think quite a lot can be read there as well. And if you look at Germany, which basically decentralized its whole health system, and it basically didn't really require any private company to for their tests to be certified, because they could just grade it as low risk, and they could just sell it in an open market. Germany did very well compared to both India and the US to fight the coronavirus situation. And it was precisely because of one reason, because they were able to test at a huge scale. And that was made possible only because decentralized systems are likely to respond more effectively to pandemics like coronavirus than systems that depend on central directives. Here, case in point is both India and US.
Yes, Akash, I think you've covered the regulatory hurdles involved in testing very well. But I think, yes, there are similar hurdles that are there for vaccine development as well. But before we move to that, how about, like, Srinath explain us how vaccines actually work?
Yeah, sure. The vaccines work by boosting the immune system's response against the pathogen, which is virus in this case. And there are actually different strategies used to make vaccines. And the most common and the conventional strategy used is to administer a weakened form of the virus or attenuated form of the virus. And this can be done either orally or even through nasal openings or through injections. And this won't be lethal enough to cause death, but there could be a few symptoms, but that's it. And overall, the outcome would be our immune system recognizes this weakened virus as a foreign body and develops antibodies against it. So if one gets exposed to the virus the next time, then the immune system can fight off against it more effectively and essentially ward off the disease. That's how it works. And these days there are more forms of like different strategies used, like DNA based vaccines and RNA based vaccines, and even viral vectors are used. The famous one, Chadoxin, also is a viral vector based vaccine. They uh, take a similar approach where the end result is somehow they boost the immune system's response against the particular virus or bacteria.
That's great. But why is it taking so much time to develop a vaccine against coronavirus? Ruchir, I think that you did some course on vaccine development. So could you please elaborate to us? Could you please explain the reason why, when everybody is waiting for a vaccine to come save us, why is it not happening so quickly?
Yes, Akash. Yeah, I actually did a course on biotechnology in healthcare, which is a part of the biotechnology department in our college. And one of the topics that was covered was how drugs and vaccines are developed in clinically. So basically, vaccine development takes a long time because there are many safety and quality standards to be met before a regulatory body approve the vaccine. So ideally, there are a standard set of steps to be followed for vaccine development. The initial stages are exploratory, and the regulation and oversight increases as the vaccine makes its way through the process. The first is the academic research and exploratory stage, as I said. Then comes the preclinical stage, and then there are phase 1 trials, for phase 2 trials, phase 3 trials, in which the number of subjects who the vaccine is being tested on is gradually increased, and placebo groups are added. And after all these phases are completed, then supply lines are built to ensure factories are set up and manufacturing is in place. So it's a long process. We have, after all these phases, you have to build factories, manufacturing, there's approval, there's distribution, there's a lot of things. And generally, this takes a long time, a very long time. Like if you go by traditional knowledge, and if you go through the supposed pandemic speed, a vaccine for coronavirus would have taken approximately around 2035 to 2036 to come through. But officials like Dr. Anthony Fauci, the top infectious disease expert in the United States administration, estimated a vaccine could arrive in around 18-20 months. Well, of course, this vaccine would be called, according to the National Academy of Sciences, a vaccine that is moving at pandemic speed, which will have an overlapping timeline of all these phases that I mentioned earlier. And a lot of scientists agree that if we do it the conventional way, there's no way we are going to reach the timeline of 18 months. And even if we do, there could be a lot of other issues like side effects and other causes that are not mentioned, which generally covered in phase 4 trials, which are optional but are done to decrease public scrutiny about the vaccine. So as you can see, there are lots and lots of stages involved in vaccine, and each and every stage has to be approved by the regulatory body so that you can proceed to the next one. So yeah, it takes a long time.
So we see that in the movie, basically there's this unscientific cure called forsythia. It's actually a hoax medicine that's claimed to be able to treat the MEV virus. We also have some equivalence or basically some comparisons when it comes to the coronavirus case in the real life. Actually, when Prince Charles was treated, uh, not treated, but basically he got better, and he was tested negative for coronavirus, say 2-3 weeks after he was tested positive. India's Ayush Minister Shripad Nayak claimed that he was treated using a homeopathy and Ayurveda drug. Now uh, we basically became a butt of the jokes because his office, Prince Charles' office, basically confirmed that there was no such treatment. Um, it's funny because India is the only country in the world which has a ministry for alternative medicines, and it has clubbed all these alternative medicines together, which have nothing to do with each other. Ayurveda, yoga, Unani, then naturopathy and homeopathy and Siddha as well. So let's leave that out a bit, and then let's talk about the more talked about drug, which is hydroxychloroquine, because Trump tweeted about it. So Srinath, is hydroxychloroquine a real drug? Does it really work? And does it work in the case of coronavirus? Is there evidence enough for us to believe that?
Well, you can't exactly compare hydroxychloroquine with forsythia kind of drugs because forsythia is just a random tonic solution that Jude Law's character made up as a cure. It's a hoax, and it doesn't even have any medicinal value as such, even in the movie. But hydroxychloroquine is not like that. It definitely has some medicinal value for malaria. It is actually an approved drug for malaria, but repurposing this drug for COVID-19 treatment is where the problem lies. And as you to answer your question, as of now, there is no consensus saying that HCQ treats COVID-19 patients, and rather it has a lot of undesirable side effects like nausea, headache, twitching, and it even causes confusion and other nervous problems. And you can also develop rashes after consuming it. So basically, you're better off without taking hydroxychloroquine in the first place. And recently, ICMR also did a study on HCQ to explore its uses as a prophylactic, as in preventive drug that you take before even you get infected. But that study was not convincing either. So there's no strong evidence to suggest the role of HCQ as a prophylactic either. So at this point, it's just like any other controversial hoax drug, and it has no uses as such. And yet it's surprising that so many doctors in India are prescribing it as if it's paracetamol and or on any other normal drug. So that's something worrisome that should be taken care of.
Well, Srinath, if there are so obvious problems with hydroxychloroquine, why is it famous in the first place?
There is this French physician called Didier Raoult, and he published a faulty paper showing that HCQ actually works very well. And the scientific approach that he took was actually the exact opposite of how one should do epidemiological studies. It is funny that he doesn't even believe in statistics and randomized controlled trials, which is the fundamental of doing any epidemiological study. And there were a lot of faults, but just to mention one of them, the age group of the median age of the group which was given hydroxychloroquine was much lesser than the median age of the control group. And obviously we know that younger population have some sort of resistance against COVID-19. So this is one major fault obviously, and he published this paper in a journal where he is the editor himself. And obviously that is a really shoddy practice, and the paper is actually now retracted. But then that's where all this drug particularly got a lot of attention, and then people just held on to it as if it were a fact.
So let's go back to Forsythia. Forsythia is a homeopathy drug. Srinath, you are studying biological sciences, biological engineering. So, what's your opinion of homeopathy as a whole?
Well, okay. It is like, in my opinion, it is just a placebo drug that uses the funda of time heals things. So it would work for generally for mild things such as fever or common cold, where you get better on your own after some time. But obviously, you can't rely on homeopathy for major diseases like cancer, or even for an infectious disease like COVID-19 for that matter, where an actual treatment is required. So that's my opinion or my 2 cents on homeopathy.
Well, even though homeopathy is in general a very scientifically questionable practice, it's really prevalent in India. And Akash, do you know why that may be the case, or that is the case actually?
Yeah, Richard, I don't really have a problem with an unscientific practice being popular. Um, to be honest, faith or religion in many cases is an unscientific practice, but it's very popular. The problem comes when the government supports an unscientific practice as if it's basically something which works. uh, and here in this case, definitely it has to do with it has to do with conditions which are related to health. In India, as I mentioned earlier, that there is an Ayush ministry and homeopathy comes under it. I think we would be better off, making a separate ministry for maybe Ayurveda, yoga, and the other Indian traditional practices, because for one, homeopathy is not Indian, it's German. Another thing more important, because the origin doesn't really matter to me. uh, Another thing is that it's definitely, as Srinath explained, it's unscientific, and it really cannot even be that even the tests can really not be done, and there's no evidence that most of these drugs work. It's sort of a placebo effect. Now, last year in 2019, a whooping 2000 crore rupees from the budget was spent on homeopathy. The government supports homeopathic colleges. The government supports the education of all these people who come out with a degree, which is called BHMS, if I'm not mistaken, Bachelor of Homeopathy, and that's
Yes,
done
yes.
through government colleges. Now, when government is putting its stamp over such a thing, definitely it's going to build sort of a trust among people, and it's bound to be popular. On the other hand, we people who have trained themselves using basically train themselves working with a doctor, even they are not allowed to practice, medicine, because it's considered that you really need a 4 year or 5 year degree to practice medicine. So I think if there is a government intervention in this case here, that should be revoked. That should really I would not advocate doing a blanket ban on homeopathy, but definitely I am all for removing all the government support to homeopathy.
Yes, Akash, totally. I think health is a very, very serious issue, and supporting unscientific practice in terms of health, I think, is a very big concern for the public. Should be a very big concern for the public. Though about the religion, I think the Indian Constitution allows the state to partially support, give financial support to religious schools and finance religious buildings.
Yeah, and
So,
also control
it may not
religion.
be- yes, exactly.
Prakash, I just wanted to add a small point here. I totally agree with your view on homeopathy, but I personally think that Ayurveda should be removed from these other forms of medicines, because I see Ayurveda as actually having a potential, because if proper research is done by looking for active ingredients in medicinal plants, like plants with medicinal values, and extracting uh, chemicals or molecules which could potentially have a medicinal value that can treat diseases, then that should be totally be used. And there are several labs even in our very own department, biotech department, where people are trying to do this. So that kind of a culture should be developed, and that aspect of Ayurveda must be given more emphasis on.
So yeah, Srinath, basically I agree. There's one more important reason I think why Ayurveda has not really been able to take off, or I'll say that scientifically establish itself, and that is the conundrum of intellectual property rights, because there is no incentive for a private company to do such an extensive research, because there would be a whole lot of hangama when basically they have to patent something that they just validated, because people will come out and say that, oh hey, this is our ancient practice, how can you patent it, which is all fine, but the problem is, that's why I'm saying I don't have an answer to it, but there is a conundrum that if they are not able to patent it, they'll definitely not invest so much of R&D on it.
Well, yeah, that's a problem for sure. I totally agree with that.
So, Ruchir, we see a lot of people fighting over supplies and food in this movie, but we didn't really see that in the real life in context of COVID-19 all that much. Matlab, I don't remember any news ki there would have been, some sort of a riot that broke out because of supply shortage. To be honest, in many of these supermarkets, even in the US and India as well, definitely when there was a panic, there was some sort of a panic buying, but then shelves were back filled again, maybe next day or next to next day. But if we look at this holistically, we definitely see that there's a problem. Economy has been hit hard. So, what do you think is the way out? What approach has India taken?
Yes, Akash. Even I remember in the initial days, I was really scared about some civil unrest or riots happening because of the massive supply shortage, which would affect the daily wage earners. And it actually, there was, I think, in the very beginning, there was a riot in Surat or somewhere in Gujarat, and I was really scared that it could grow big, but it was controlled. Coming to how the government has responded to the crisis and what the approach has been. So the fiscal stimulus that the government has introduced has taken more has more emphasis on the supply side and very less on the demand side, and I feel that is exactly the opposite of what should have been done. So let me break it down. The fiscal stimulus is actually difficult to discern because the package is neither clear nor transparent about the cost to be borne by the government in each component. On May 12th, the government announced a relief package of about $20 trillion, and which they said would be about 10% of the about 10% of the country's GDP. So out of this, about $3 trillion would go to MSMEs for credit for loans without collateral. So this was a very clear push towards the supply side, where the government was trying to give access to easy credit for those to the MSMEs, though they didn't really seem to be happy about the response. Coming to the important point of this stimulus that was provided. Firstly, there are, of course, different estimates by financial analysts suggesting that the fiscal stimulus is in the range of 0.7 to 1.3% of the GDP. Another very important point of the stimulus provided, about 30% is a drawdown on the existing funds available with the state governments and existing budget provisions. Thus, the effective stimulus is, in terms of extra resources provided by the government, is only actually 60% of what they say it is. Its contribution to domestic demand will be minuscule, given that private final consumer expenditure in India is about 60% of the GDP. It is clear that the design of this package seeks to focus on the supply side with an emphasis to providing liquidity rather than on the demand side by stepping up government expenditure. The stress on the demand side while neglecting the stress on the supply side while neglecting the demand side shows a kind of a flawed understanding of economics in the crisis. And so even in normal circumstances, we all know that the speed of adjustment on the supply side is much slower compared to the demand side. And at present, if there is little or no increase in demand, supply responses will be slower than usual, of course, because the suppliers or the producers would not wish to pile up on inventories of unsold goods. Hence, I think the government ought to take an approach or provide a stimulus which is more focused on the demand side.
Yeah, I mean, I concur. I think there's another bigger problem with basically a supply side solution, and that problem I think has to do with the fact, that a lot of this money, when you hand it over in form of a subsidy to companies or even MSMEs, it basically ends up with people who are politically very connected. So and that has something to do with public choice economics, and that is something that we discussed in our panchayat episode. So people who are interested could go listen to it there. um, but Richard, demand, you talked about demand side stimulus of sorts. So what is demand side stimulus? How do we do it?
Yes, Akash. So one particular way of providing demand side stimulus could be through direct cash benefits and direct cash payments, not benefits as such. So the log and it is a practice that has been that has actually happened in a lot of countries like Canada, US, Hong Kong, Japan, and Thailand, where they provided cash relief directly to the demand side and to everyone who was affected by the crisis, on especially the daily wage earners. Coming to direct, to give you an example, so as I mentioned, countries like Canada, US, Hong Kong, Japan have followed this policy. Canada is already providing 2,000 Canadian dollars for 4 months to those who have lost their jobs, are sick, or have to stay at home. In the United States, eligible people apply for a one-time payment of $1,200, which was a big news back then, and it gained a lot of popularity on Twitter as well. In Hong Kong, they are providing a cash handout of about 10,000 Hong Kong dollars for each permanent resident aged 18 or and above. On the other hand, in India, there has been no new scheme as such that was announced. The original financial package, financial stimulus that was announced way back, even before May, I think in that stimulus, they mentioned that each woman was to be given 500 rupees, each woman who had a Jan Dhan account, of course, and 1,000 rupees to senior citizens, poor widows, and the disabled. It also tried to hike the payment for Manrega. So most of the relief in India as such at this point of time has not been in the form of DCBs. I think not even 1% of the stimulus announced was intended to boost demand side, to boost the demand side actually. So I think DCBs or the direct cash payments are the way ahead. But the question to be answered is, of course, how do we finance the direct cash payments? And
Yeah.
there are actually
So
a lot
I
of
mean,
ways.
the two ways that I can think of that these solutions can be financed is, one by raising tax, which would be very difficult given this pandemic. I mean, because people are also earning less. So maybe you could, tax the rich. But in India, how much can you tax the rich? I mean, you've already taxing the rich to death. But another way to do this is to, finance it through debt. So the government can take a debt. Do you have anything more to say about it, Richard?
Yes, Akash, of course. And I think you missed one of the possible solutions that the governments have used in the past to finance
Oh wow, that's a
themselves.
devil. That's a devil.
Yes, and that is increasing the money supply in the economy, which generally has always led to very bad outcomes. And especially when it spirals down and causes hyperinflation, Germany, Venezuela, all these countries, there was hyperinflation, and we know what happened. They just had to reissue new currencies or take up other foreign currencies as their own currencies. So coming to the actual question though, there are other problems also that I feel should be addressed. For example, see, because developing countries can borrow in their own currencies at low interest rates. Most of these countries have used fiscal and monetary policies to finance the health response and provide relief. But in case of developing countries, they face massive constraints on their ability to do whatever it takes. All right. Firstly, of course, raising taxes, printing money, or borrowing are limited. And because of the prohibitively expensive borrowing that most developing countries face in the international market, the international community has to play some role. Basically, as you may understand, when one takes a loan from the international community, it's not just the debt that they're facing. They also face a lot of forex risk, which developing countries generally tend to avoid. Because in times of crisis, the values of the currencies in which they have borrowed generally tends to go upwards. Another thing is leakage when they announce such stimuluses. So in most developing countries, the lion's share of public health spending goes to the rich and the smallest to the poor. For example, in India, 33% of it goes to the richest 20% actually, and 8% to the poorest.
Wow,
So
that's
most of
that's
these,
one powerful, basically data against redistribution.
yes, and most of these spending goes to hospitals, of course, which are located in urban areas, whereas the poor live in rural areas. And the especially for India's case, for example, the poor's main link with the health system is through PHCs, the primary health clinics. But these are, very under-equipped, understaffed, and are infamous for poor service. We know that there's a lot of absentees in PHCs in India, and I think that I read a statistics that about the health workers in PHCs are absent about 40% of the time. So thus, in addition to facing the difficulties in financing the coronavirus response, developing countries like India face substantial fiscal policy challenges from leakage, and that is, of course, one thing that one needs to consider.
Hmm. So basically, we come to this conclusion, Ruchir, that DCBs are distortionary. So direct cash benefit, or you could say direct cash transfer, is
Any
something which
any
is,
kind of any
yeah,
kind of response at this point, or
definitely,
stimulus at this
definitely.
point,
But it's still
distortionary.
the best response that we've got. So either the government can just you know stay put, do nothing, or can the best thing that it can do is maybe give some sort of a relief by directly
Direct cash.
transferring cash to maybe all its people. But yeah, as we saw, the Indian government took the other route. But one good thing that I think that did come out of it, and the credit where it's due, there were reforms. There were some reforms. Definitely, one major reform was reform in agriculture, where the government decided to, basically repeal the ECA, which was the Essential Commodities Act, and then the APMC monopsony was also broken across India. We don't really have much time to talk about it, and we'll talk about it in maybe some further episodes. But definitely, there is something that I think, and there's again another conversation going on labor laws across the countries after MP and UP did some reforms, or uh, if I might say that, just UP just decided to uh, cancel all the central labor laws except a few.
Yes,
So
definitely.
yeah,
I think
so
what
there's a
I'm
new
trying to do.
conversation is something that all three of us can agree on, that there's a new conversation happening, and that's certainly something which is good. And as the old adage goes, never waste a crisis, and
Exactly,
maybe something
exactly.
good would come out of it. So let's end this episode on that optimistic note. See, Srinath, do you have anything to add?
Well, yeah, it makes sense to me too. It seems obvious that a major supply side stimulus isn't very sensible if there isn't sufficient demand for it.
Indeed. Thanks for coming over to our podcast, Srinath. It was a pleasure hosting you.
Yeah, thank you, Akash. Glad to be here too. It was a genuinely interesting discussion and a lot of fun. Thank you again.